Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. You're watching Daily Debrief. I'm Siddhant Ani, and on the show today, Prashant will talk to us about Tunisia's new draft constitution, as well as the US Supreme Court's highly controversial ruling on the Environmental Protection Agency. And Anish will then join us to talk about a building up crisis in West Papua. First up, our top story: Tunisia's President Kais Saied has unveiled the draft of a new constitution ahead of a referendum scheduled for the 25th of this month. The draft was published in the bi-weekly Gazette, the Journal of the Republic of Tunisia, and most crucially, in Article 1 itself, stipulates that Tunisia is a presidential republic. Sadak Belaid, a former law professor who was named by Saied to head the drafting committee, has condemned this version of the constitution, calling it dangerous and dissimilar to the first draft proposed by the committee, according to reports in the Tunisian press. Prashant, first up, what can you tell us about the draft constitution that's been now presented officially to the people of Tunisia?
Right, Siddhant, for some context, of course, we know that in July last year, President Kais Saied began what many called a presidential coup, taking on, he dismissed parliament, he started taking on more powers, he consolidated that in the coming months. Since that time, he's dismissed judges, he's, removed the powers of an important committee that monitors it, and he's basically abrogated more and more powers to himself. Now, the fig leaf for all of this was the fact that he was going to propose a new constitution for which there will be a democratic referendum, etc., etc. And that is the context in which this draft has come out.
Right.
Now, as expected by many people in the opposition, the political spectrum, as expected by the left, this is a draft that really seeks to cement the president's power over Tunisia. So what this kind of seeks to do is to reverse what happened after the 2011 Arab Spring. We know that after the Tunisia democracy took root in Tunisia, it was very chaotic, very messy, a lot of problems, but nonetheless there was some kind of a working system. Now, as that working system faced a crisis, Kais Saied emerges as a savior, and his solution is really this. Basically, so what you see is that in the new draft, his government will be completely answerable to the president. He will have the right to dismiss ministers, etc. Parliament can only remove the government with a 2/3 majority. Then the fact that he makes all the important appointments, he makes, for instance, he has the right to propose treaties. So basically, like you said, this is, once again centralizing power, which was the case in Tunisia before the Arab Spring, and which is what the reforms, the post-Arab Spring movements tried to sort of reverse. So that is what we are seeing right now. A lot of problematic aspects here. One including the fact that judges, civil servants, many civil servants will not have the right to strike, which is important considering that judges have been protesting in Tunisia in recent times. The fact that, for instance, a new House of Parliament is going to be introduced, which will have more representation from the regions. In some sense, it's very unclear how, but that is more likely to serve as some kind of a check on the lower house of the parliament, which is the directly elected one. So in some senses, Kais Saied not only strengthening his own powers, but also checkmating the powers of the legislature to actually make any substantial kind of difference. So what we're probably going to see is, even though technically, so many commentators have pointed out that many of the freedoms provided in the Tunisian constitution have technically not been changed, they're still there. But what is likely to happen is that there will be other ways through which many of these can be restricted, like the parliament aspect I mentioned.
Right.
I mean, if there's another house which is more or less answerable to the president, really what can the one house alone do? So what we're seeing is actually a very dangerous precedent. Now, the fact is that Kais Saied, had this as some kind of a public exercise. He invited suggestions. There was very little enthusiasm for that. Now there's going to be a referendum this month in July as well. There may not be very much enthusiasm for that as well, but whether enough people will vote to oppose it is a real big question. So it's even possible that it might just get passed in some form or the other, and could push Tunisia down into a very problematic path, which it struggled so hard, because before the Arab Spring, Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali was in power for many, many decades. The Arab Spring, with great difficulty, pulled him down. And now we see the possibility of another president. Kais Saied can, although his term is going to be for 2 years, in case of emergency, he can continue. So that's a lot of aspects in this draft which are quite alarming.
And clearly, according to what you've told us with the draft, opposition to this will be strong. So what kind of mobilization can we expect in the weeks leading up to this referendum to get people to come out and voice their views, particularly those against this centralization of power?
Right. So I think a large sections of the political opposition are very much against this. We know that the biggest union in Tunisia, the president, I believe, has spoken out calling this alarming, although he's not. I don't think they're given instruction to their members to vote in a particular way. The challenge is, I mean, there'll be demonstrations, mobilizations, campaigning, you can be assured of all that. The problem, however, is that I think there is also a loss of faith in the institutions of the Tunisian government which were created post-2011. The COVID-19 crisis, the massive unemployment, the economic crisis, all of which has led to a deep-felt cynicism with many of these institutions, which is what leads to the question as to whether enough people will come out on the streets to oppose Kais Saied's. The mobilizations on the streets have been quite substantial, but whether enough people will come out to vote against this referendum, or whether the turnout might be low, in which case he might benefit, is really the question. So I think what it will boil down to in the next few weeks is the question of whether the political opposition, whether the people's movements can sort of mobilize enough of their people to come out and vote against the referendum, or whether it will be a low turnout one, in which case Kais Saied might eke out a victory. So that's really the big challenge before, that's really the million-dollar question, so to speak. And if this constitution does get implemented, we know that there will be an election in December 2021, which is what he said. Until then, he will continue to rule by decree, something that, again, all the opposition has taken huge objection to. But he will continue to rule by decree till December, and even after that, if a new parliament is sworn in, their powers are likely to be not
severely
curtailed as well. So it's a big question mark on the future of democracy in Tunisia. But also, I think it boils down to, in many parts of the region, we see a similar situation. We see a similar situation in Egypt, for instance, which people have talked about. And many other regions as well have been sort of compared to many other countries in the region have been compared to Tunisia, because there is a the situation which enables such strongmen to come to power, and you subvert many of the institutional processes that are there, claiming that they seek to sort of reform the country, or bring order to the country, but which all sounds great on paper. But the fact is that ultimately Kais Saied himself has demonstrated that he really does not have any alternative policy frameworks as far as the economy is concerned. It is not that in just about a year, this will be, I think, the anniversary this month. In just about a year, he has managed to turn around the economy or bring any kind of meaningful change to the country. He hasn't been able to do that. And so, difficult times for Tunisians in the coming months as well, because are we going to see an excessively centralized government is the question.
Right. We'll, of course, keep tracking that as we have consistently on Daily Debrief, Prashant, but we'll be talking about the US Supreme Court next. Following on the heels of a disastrous opinion that pushed back women's reproductive rights by nearly half a century, the conservative-dominated US Supreme Court voted 6-3, restricting the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon emissions. The ruling will benefit power plants as well as fossil fuel companies throughout the US and cripple the government's ability to potentially, at least, mitigate an escalating climate crisis. The decision, which was written by Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts and joined by all the conservative justices, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh, means that the EPA does not have the authority to impose caps on carbon emissions or mandating a shift to cleaner energy sources. Congress, now not climate policymakers and scientists, will handle the task of reducing the US's greenhouse gas emissions. Prashant, what more can you tell us about West Virginia versus the EPA, which is the case at the core of this new ruling?
Right. So today, we're recording on July the 4th, the Independence Day. It's always a big question of who really got independence that day in 1776. But quite an appalling verdict. There's no real other way of describing it, because at a time when countries are sort of gearing up to face the worst of climate change, you have the US Supreme Court saying that an agency called the Environmental Protection Agency cannot impose restrictions, across the board restrictions, and it can only do very minor curbs on certain plants and etc. And their logic for this is that the US Congress has not given enough of a mandate to the Environmental Protection Agency for that. So it's unbelievable that this kind of a verdict passes, because across the world people really are trying to struggle to see what kind of policies can be implemented. It's difficult enough to implement those policies, but here the US Supreme Court has said that the agency has no right to even implement them. So, this really shows the completely dysfunctional nature of the US political system right now. It seems completely at the mercy and completely following the whims of the super rich, of various industry lobbies. This is clearly a ruling which will only benefit, like you said, the fossil fuel companies, the big industrialists, and which will cause a huge amount of suffering. And this is important, not just to the United States, but to the entire world. Because the US had Its targets were like, I think, to cut emissions by half by the end of the decade and emission-free the power sector by 2035. And power plants approximately contribute 30% of the CO2 output. And it is these power plants which cannot be systematically regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency because of this verdict. Now, saying that, by throwing everything back to the Congress, what it basically means that we are throwing it back to a institution which is completely deadlocked.
Yeah.
Because right now in the United States Senate, one senator, that is West Virginia, same state by the way, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who is known to be, who is often known to be someone who has taken the side of fossil fuel companies and big industries like that.
Yeah.
He is the person who can block this. So this is exactly what it means, in the sense that the Supreme Court and Congress together are playing this sort of game which just increases the dysfunctionality of the US government, prevents anything from doing, puts people's lives at risk in the United States and across the world. And we are seeing this time and again and again. So this is really, it's called the world's oldest democracy, but what's really happening is it is completely going into dysfunctionality and becoming a threat to global peace and survival.
Yeah, we were talking previously about the dismemberment of institutions in Tunisia, and US commentators frequently talk about how third world and developing nations are not concentrating enough on building up their institutions. Here we see the Supreme Court, a key institution in the United States, moving towards this far right trajectory unchecked. That is also very much in focus.
Absolutely. It is. I think we need to sort of always use democracy in quotes when we're talking about the United States, because it has always been designed in such a way, the institutions of the US have been designed in such a way to protect the power of certain sections, the rich sections, the elite sections, the largely white sections. It's their power that these institutions serve to protect. And there's no greater evidence of the fact that the United States Supreme Court exists with lifetime. People can serve under Supreme Court for 30 years.
Yeah.
And, they can write their judgments with no real question, no possibility of review, no very little possibility of it being overturned. The United States Senate, for instance, is one of the most profoundly anti-democratic institutions that exist, because a small state with a very small population has the same a number of senators as a state with a huge population. The kind of the US Supreme Court itself in 2010, for instance, in a verdict, allowed the inflow of huge amounts of money, what is called the Citizens United verdict, into politics, which basically means that the rich and the various lobbies together can basically buy and completely influence the work of politicians with very little checks and balances. What we're seeing is basically the rich and the elite are basically carving as much of their pound of flesh as possible without giving two hoots about the rest of the population. So we are seeing an extremely anti-democratic direction in which the United States is going. It was always like that, let's be clear about it.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing right now is possibly one of the most powerful examples of that, most powerful manifestations of that. And this seriously throws into question what happens in a few years in the United States. And the unfortunate thing is, across the world, we all need to care. Yeah. Because the US is the world's biggest military power. It is a nuclear power. It has 800 bases across the world, which means that its internal collapse, its internal dysfunctionality, its internal lack of governance will be something we all suffer from, which is what I was saying. The climate change thing is a good example, because just like these gases will impact the whole world, its own policies too will continue to impact everyone as well. So, and important to note, for instance, that probably in the next term the Supreme Court will consider what is a key case, which might even completely destroy the election structure even more further, which gives state legislatures, by the way, complete right to decide how their election systems will be organized. Yeah. Which means in 2024 we could have a completely chaotic presidential election. What we saw in 2020 with Donald Trump could be nothing really.
Nothing at all.
So that's where we are at right now. Very alarming situation for the entire world, unfortunately.
Right. Thanks very much, Prashant. We're moving on to our final story of the day, which also, I suppose, in many ways talks of the same kind of neoliberal and extractivist economic policies that are leading to conflict. This is, of course, in the context of Indonesia, where protests against the passage of legislation by Indonesia's parliament to create 3 new provinces in the Papua region continue, with West Papuan activists alleging police brutality after thousands, including students, took to the streets to oppose the move. Currently split between Papua and West Papua, the region will now be divided into 5 provinces with the addition of South Papua, Central Papua and Highland Papua. West Papua has had low-intensity conflict since a disputed 1969 UN-supervised vote brought the region under Indonesian control. It's home to one of the world's biggest remaining rainforests, as well as major gold, silver, copper, oil and gas reserves. The Indonesian government is constructing a 4,000-kilometer Trans-Papua highway, aiming to connect some of the country's biggest industrial setups and ease the process of extraction. For more on this story, I spoke earlier via video conference to Anish. Anish, the current protests that are ongoing in West Papua, what exactly are the demands of the indigenous people?
So the demand is obviously to take back the current set of laws that they passed, which is to divide the province. It was already bifurcated, but to divide it further into 5 provinces, new provinces, which is based entirely on ethnographic studies done during the colonial period, the Dutch colonial period. So it is a problematic thing because according to the self-determination activists in West Papua, according to them, this is an attempt to not only steal whatever little autonomy is granted to the two easternmost provinces in the country, but also to actually divide the West Papuan people along tribal and ethnic lines, to the point that it actually affects their solidarity and their political clout within the overall federation. So the whole point here is to actually weaken any political power that people may have. You have to remember it's a very sparsely populated region, even though it's a very large region to begin with. The size of Sweden, and they have barely 5 billion people. And this actually, and it's quite like widespread, like they are very sparsely populated regions across. So when you create such provinces, you'll be creating provinces that have population of less than 1 million, like smaller than most cities even in Indonesia to begin with. So this attempt is to actually weaken them in many ways, administratively speaking, because it will be then easier for the federal government or the central government in Jakarta to actually make policies that will affect not only their political and social standing, but also to open up the whole market of mining, which they have recently moved to privatize. We have talked about the omnibus bill and everything, right? So this is a larger part of the extractivist policies that the government is also trying to push for.
Right. With that, Anish, because on Daily Debrief, we haven't really looked at the region as well as West Papua specifically before. Could you give us a bit of the recent social and political history of the region to set in context some of what's going on today?
So the whole dispute that is happening right now in West Papua, the matter of self-determination, came up in the 1960s on a very debauched decolonization attempt by the Dutch, and at some level by the United Nations as well. And then obviously Indonesia's annexation of the territory, and then the whole botched up referendum that actually was basically held on gunpoint based on like just very few selected people. I think something like around 1,000 people. Yeah, exactly. 1,000 or so chiefs, and like who they declared as chiefs and leaders of the people. And that's how they did this referendum and annexed the province. And then ever since then, we have had this tensions coming and going all the time. And a large part of that is also partly the racism that is ingrained in the whole federal system at this point, where this is probably the most backward region and also the most neglected region in the country. There is absolutely no intervention in developmental policies in many cases, in most regions even, and that has actually affected how West Papuans view Indonesians and the Indonesian government as a whole. It is also because of broken promises in 2003, with the after few years after the democratic revolution and everything. They actually bifurcated the province without even consulting with the local parliament, and that was one of the first attempts to actually divide West Papua along ethnic and to create smaller administrative regions that they can easily control. And ever since then, there have been attempts to do that. But right now, this is the first time that they have actually passed a law to do it. Over the past 3 or 4 years, we have seen tensions going very high. Or something like 60,000 people have been displaced in the militancy and the militarization of the region, which it is one of the most militarized places in Southeast Asia. We must always remember that. And that has actually affected everybody, not just the indigenous people, but also the poorer working class settlers that have come from the mainland to West Papua. So this is a humanitarian crisis that is happening already, and it is in the middle of that they're trying to create these, trying to use this province expansion policy as a quick fix way to get out of this situation. But that is also obviously not going to work, because this will only add to the tensions that are already simmering on the ground.
So multifaceted then, like political and social, of course, but also an ecological sort of crisis in the making in West Papua. Thanks very much, Anish, for that update. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. From Anish, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team, thanks very much for watching. For more details on these stories, as well as all the other work we do, you can head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back again tomorrow. See you then. Goodbye.